On the 2nd of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was thrown into the Tower of London, accused of treason and of committing adultery with 5 different men, over the space of about 2 years. William Brereton and Sir Francis Weston, gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, Henry Norris, groom of the stool and chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, Mark Smeaton, who was a court musician and a groom of the Privy Chamber, and finally, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, a prominent courtier and the Queen's own brother. The men all went to the block on the 17th of May, and the Queen herself was executed 2 days later. Normally it would have been an axeman doing the job, but instead they brought a professional swordsman over from Calais, who had a very sharp sword, and this was supposedly a courtesy for the Queen, so her head could be cut off cleanly with a single stroke. So what should we make of all of this? There are 2 main possibilities. Firstly, and this used to be the most common view, we could suppose that Henry VIII or his minister manufactured the charges against Anne, so the adulteries were pure fiction. They provided a pretext for this to happen. And this was a view of S.T. Bindolph, who wrote in 1963, where a Borgia would have used poison, a Tudor used the law. But a second possibility is that Anne really did commit adultery with at least some, or possibly all, of the accused men. The case for Anne's innocence was made at length in 2 books published in the 1980s. The first is Eric Ives' Anne Boleyn of 1986, and the second is Retha Warnicke's The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, published in 1989. And to simplify, Ives' main argument is that Anne really fell because of factionalism at court. So he says there was conflict between a left-wing or evangelical Boleyn faction and a right-wing or conservative Aragonese faction, and that he argues that Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, was originally part of the Boleyn faction, but they had a falling out over foreign policy, so he switched allegiances over to the Aragonese faction, and they were the ones that manufactured Anne's fall. Ives stuck to this position for the rest of his life, so for example in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, he says it is clear that Anne was innocent. Warnicke's book, by contrast, argues that the only reason Henry turned against Anne was because of a disformed miscarriage that occurred, and she says this miscarriage was the sole reason for the king's setting in motion the process that led to Anne's execution. And this might seem a little extreme, that there was this monocausal explanation for what happened, but overall she agrees with Ives that Anne was innocent and that the charges were manufactured. But generally, the idea that Anne was innocent has been the scholarly consensus for a long time. As Joel Hurstfield asked in 1981, does any historian seriously believe the charges? Could it be, however, that Anne really was guilty of adultery? This is the argument that was made by George Bernard in a 1991 article in the English Historical Review. And he says that Anne's guilt is the safest guess. He says we can't know for sure, but it's the safest guess that it really did happen. And various lines of argument led him to this conclusion. For example, the fact that the musician Mark Smeaton pled guilty. And there is also some evidence that Anne was on very familiar terms with some of the accused. Generally, he rejects the factional argument as implausible and kind of a house built on the sand, because there's very patchy evidence that these kind of factional maneuvers took place at the court of King Henry. Eric Ives responded to George Bernard in another article published in the following year in the same academic journal, and he argues really that Anne was innocent beyond a shadow of a doubt, and various lines of evidence lead him to this conclusion, some more plausible than others. He says, for example, that Anne swore her innocence on the sacrament, and she wouldn't have risked doing that if she was really guilty. But actually there are many examples in English history of oath-breaking and swearing false oaths, so I think we can't judge it as so clear-cut as that. In the medieval church there was actually a procedure for people who swore a false oath, and the kind of penance wasn't so severe, so you had to give alms and so forth, but it wasn't so deadly serious as Ives seems to suggest. But Ives's strongest evidence for Anne's innocence is the indictments that were put before the court. So he went through these indictments really carefully, and he found that only about 6 out of 20 of the alleged offences were plausible. In most of them, the dates and the places were all wrong, so the adultery had allegedly happened in in a certain location, but on that date the court was actually in a different castle, so it can't have happened on that day. But I think even this evidence is not so compelling as Ives argues. Tudor state trials were political occasions, of course, and often you had cases where you had these kind of inaccuracies. They kind of operated on the basis of throw lots of mud at the wall and some of it will stick, so generally, they have more inaccuracy than other criminal and civil trials. Another point that's worth talking about, because it's quite uncertain, is that Ives says that having sex with a consenting queen wasn't treason under English law. But if you look at the 1351 Treason Act, that says that if you violate a queen consort, then that is treason. So it's only a few steps away from that as to classify as treason the kind of offences which Anne and her supposed lovers were accused of. And it wasn't uncommon for the English courts to broaden the extent of the treason statute, and that became known as constructive treason. So again, a slightly uncertain point, but I think it's not so clear-cut as Ives seems to suggest. Bernard revisited this debate in a 2010 book called Anne Boleyn, Fatal Attractions. And he admits that if you put all this before a completely neutral court of law, then the verdict would be not proven. But he still says that it's probable that at least some of the charges against Anne were true. And I think some of the case for the defense is based on incredulity. So people say surely the Queen couldn't have been guilty of a serial adultery and incest, which may be so, but some people do commit adultery with lots of partners, and some people do even commit incest. So I think we can't completely rule that out of court just based on the implausibility of it. Yes, it does seem scandalous and sensational, but that doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. So I think George Bernard is right to say that Anne could have been guilty of adultery, but I would change his probably to possibly, because I think the evidence is not really all that strong, and I wouldn't put it past Henry to manufacture the charges, or indeed affection of his counsellors. There are some rather suspicious aspects to this story, like the fact that Henry VIII already had another wife lined up, ready to marry, only 11 days later. But at the end of the day, in cases like this, it's very unlikely we're ever going to know for certain whether or not Anne did commit adultery, and any historian who says that it's certain one way or the other is probably exaggerating. So thank you for watching. That's all I've got for this time, and stay tuned. I'm going to make more videos like this for you again in the future.